Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the Fundação Serralves and the Goethe Institute and Nuno Crespo for inviting me to be here as a moderator of this Andres Lepik lecture. It is really a pleasure and an honor. I will start by reading briefly some aspects of Andres Lepik's vast and important curriculum, and later on, after his lecture, I will throw one or two questions, and we will have a debate that will also be open to the audience, of course. So, Andres Lepik, it's not easy to say, was a curator and head of architecture collection at the Neue National Gallery in Berlin. Between 2000 and 2006, he presented a series of large-scale architecture exhibitions and co-organized exhibition Mise in Berlin with MoMA. From 2007 to 2011, he worked as a curator in the architecture and design department of MoMA. There, he was involved in the Young Architects program at PCI, and recently presented the exhibition Small Scale, Big Change, New Architectures of Social Engagement. His recent focus is Moderators of Change, and his recent focus is on using the museum exhibition as an active platform to engage visitors in contemporary issues to architecture and to contribute as a curator in changing the public perception of architecture and its social relevance. His recent book, that I was just mentioning, presents contemporary examples of social engagement in architecture on a global scale and explores various strategies on how design can actively influence undeserved communities. So, as you see, it's a very topical and contemporary subject. His lecture today is called, I think, Ethics and Aesthetics, Reclaiming the Social Value of Architecture. And I have a great expectation on listening to it. So thanks for being here, Andres. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George, for this kind introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for everyone to come. And I'm deeply impressed by the vast audience here. It's great. I'm happy that this topic, which seems a little bit dry as the title, but I promise it is not dry. I will show you some really strong images and strong examples that architecture can really change places, change people, and change sometimes even the mood in a city, and that architecture can have a real power. And that's it's my optimism, that's my belief that architecture can change. And to confess in the beginning, I'm not an architect, I'm an art historian, always focused on architecture history. So I'm kind of not a professional, but makes maybe me in the eyes of an architect not qualified enough, but for the rest of humanity, maybe I have a greater distance and a greater objectivity because I'm not part of the business that architecture is nowadays. So having this said, I want to give you some overview on the structure, what I'm going to talk about. So the first part is the part, what is the social relevance of architecture today? The second, what can architects in fact do? Third, I will show you some projects, and at the end I will finish with a conclusion with some ideas in general. So, what is the social relevance of architecture by today? I choose a very strong image to illustrate what my thesis is, and it's not only my personal thesis. I think it's a belief of many people nowadays all over the world that architecture has become a profession that serves not 1%, but maybe the 1% of the 1% of the society in the global communities. So this is the architecture of the star architects who are traveling around the world first class and designing these kind of high-rise buildings that at the end are published in these magazines that you all know of. This is just a random selection of some magazines we found in our university library, and this is the covers. And if you look at it, there's one thing missing. It's human beings, right? I mean, this is for me one of the central aspects what I'm normally talking to in jury meetings and with architects. So for whom are you designing? For these magazines, for these publications, for these images that you want to bring into the internet and the magazines, or are you designing for real people, for people who, like you and me, and maybe for people who don't even know what architecture might be? And on the other hand, there is the development of, that you all know of, kind of this housing market where architecture is not even involved because it's an economy that has taken off itself. And I wouldn't call the people who are designing these houses an architect. This is kind of, would be really not fair for the architecture as we know of to call the people architects here. But this is what is happening, and this is the market of housing that has had the well-known impact of the crisis in 2008 when you remember, it was the banks that subsidized and financed the housing market in America that broke down first and then created a domino effect on the global economy. So it has to do with buildings, and the same thing that we have to talk about in this lecture is the other side of architecture, where no architects go and where they don't want to go and where they don't care about, let's say mostly, and where also in the universities normally, as much as I can observe, it's not taught how to deal with these kind of developments. And this is the favelas in Caracas. And I could have shown other favelas, and I will show some other examples of, let's say, low-cost housing on the lowest end, where no architect will ever go inside. And for many reasons, not only because it's dangerous, but there is no market, so why would he go there? But, and I just throw out some arguments which are maybe well known to many of you, maybe not, but to underline a little bit the goal where I want to reach with this lecture, what architects can really do. So you all know about the urban growth. It's not in the industrialized areas where we have, like in Germany, we have like even a shrinking society, so there is not an urban growth any longer, only a very slow one. But what you can see here, there's like a big area in Africa where the urban growth is extreme, and it's not a growth that is controlled by planners that have a kind of an idea working hand in hand with the politicians to create a better social life for people. But what's happening is the slum population in Africa, and I just picked here one example. We could also look into the slum populations in Latin America, but in Africa it's maybe the most strong figures and numbers that we can pick up here. And you can see that in countries like Nigeria, you have like a 60% or like, about 60% people living in favelas or in slums. So I will finish up with these horror pictures quite soon, so don't worry. This is then the other side of Africa. This is Angola. Some people might have seen this image already. Angola is very rich with oil now, and since they have not planned enough for the growth of their cities, they invited Chinese developers to build the cities, and this is why it looks like China. It's a city that was, it's called Quilamba, and it was built for 200,000 people. And you see, it's not yet ready, and they brought the Chinese workers, the Chinese material, and they built it up from zero for a middle class in Angola that doesn't exist. So the reality of this Quilomba city is that it's mostly empty, because nobody can afford, like in the middle class, the rich people won't go there. They built totally different houses, and the poor people can't afford to go there. So this is kind of the failures of planning, and this is why I think architecture is very much needed. And the last image in that series is, I don't show you the terrible images of the last days, earthquakes in Nepal. I show you only the image of a magazine, The Architect, which is, let's say, the official magazine that defines architects, like this is for the Architects Association in America, that defines the style or what the architects believe to be in America. And this is one image I picked up because I thought it's very, very clear that this is how see architects themselves, mostly, not all. Like, you see the houses are falling down, the smoke is going up in the air, and here with the architects, like it's very politically correct, so it's a female and a male, but in this case, the male looks a little bit brownish, so a little bit like could be a black guy, but not really. So, and this is now, they coming and rescue not the human beings, but they come and build new buildings. So is this the role? Is this how architects see themselves nowadays? I have my doubts that this should be the right role of architects. So second part, very quickly, that's a very short one. What can architects really do? This is only throwing up through theses, and then I show you the real projects. So I think first thing is architects should more reflect on the contemporary situation, and I think situation means the local, the global situation both together, and think about what is my role in this game. Is it just to deliver designs to a community or to a rich, people who pay for me, or is it my role also an ethical role, taking a part, taking a say in the developments that are happening and to design solutions for the future. And to look back into the 20th century, which would be worth a separate lecture, it hasn't been like nowadays that architects didn't care about what is going on in the favelas, in the slums on the low end. It was the second CIAM Congress in Frankfurt in 1927 when the cover of the magazine, I can translate, Die Wohnung für das Existenzminimum. So it's the housing for the lowest income. And this was the second CIAM Congress in Frankfurt. It was, they had a great shortage of housing in Germany after the First World War, and this is when architects thought about not only about building for the upper end, but for like all levels of society. And the famous Siedlung Törten, so that's kind of a project built by the Bauhaus in Dessau for the low income, was considered by Walter Gropius to be a housing for the lowest income, and that's why he designed these houses for mechanical, like for industrial production, that they could be produced industrially, so to keep the costs extremely low. This was his idea, and also Römerstadt by Ernst May, what you see here, the postcard, was all aiming at the lowest income. And just to show you other examples from history of 20th century, there is this famous exhibition, Sonne, Luft und Haus für alle, so sun, air, and a house for everyone, in 1932 by Martin Wagner, the famous head of building in Berlin in 1930s. And this was on the fairground in Berlin, an exhibition where the architecture elite of that time, like Walter Gropius and Bruno Taut and Erich Mendelssohn, they all took part in this exhibition, and each one built a house for the lowest income with the goal that it would be an incremental housing, that it should be available for a very, very low price, and with the possibility that the dwellers, that the people who buy that house for the lowest price can build it out themselves according to their growing income in the future, because it was expected that people would have would get profit from an economic uprising in Germany again. But the idea was first give them a very, very simple, very small house. And I think the same thing happened also in America for a while in the famous exhibition on international style. It was later called, because there was a book related to it, but the show was called Modern Architecture International Exhibition. And everybody knows the famous, like, look into the first room, but there was the fifth room, which was about slum upgrading. So this was with a dwelling with a Siedlung in Kassel, and there was two panels comparing Rotterdam and a slum in New York, showing that it is possible that architecture can solve the problems for the poor with good design. And this is, I think, is very important to show that architects took that role, and designers and also curators in this case, to show this to the general audience. So to sum it up, like, there was also bigger experiments in the 20th century, like especially in this idea of the incremental housing, the famous Prevey experiment in 1969, 1973, where architects, as you can see, Aldo van Eyck, and they were all, Candelis Woods, they were all participating in this experiment, and most of these houses are still standing, and the people really built them out, and there's a great documentation on that this was very successful as an experiment. But these experiments, and this is my question, why aren't they happening nowadays? Why aren't there kind of Prevey experiments here in the areas where we would need them? So what can architects do? Second thesis is also they can organize exhibitions. You all remember the 7th International Architecture Biennale, maybe not all of you, because some were not even born. This was 2002 in Venice, and I started with this big topic, less aesthetics and more ethics. And I was, at that time, I was still a student, I was getting a little bit confused and puzzled, because I thought, why less aesthetics and more ethics? There's something wrong. Because why would aesthetics and ethics be exclusive? That doesn't make sense for me. So I thought it should read more aesthetics and more ethics together. This is what it should be. And apart from that, there are some seats in the front if you want. There's still some more space. So I thought you should bring these things together. And now, not to go back to the full history of why I did these exhibitions, but I thought I was sort of critical. I wanted to react to this thesis of that aesthetics and ethics can't go together. And that's why I thought we should bring it together and show examples that are successful and that are helpful at the same time. So when I started at MoMA as a curator for architecture, I looked back into the history of the MoMA's exhibitions, and I saw there were some exhibitions addressing the question of the social relevance of architecture, but only a few. So like the exhibition International Style was including one element, but later on MoMA was taking more and more the role of like showing big names, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, so kind of supporting the idea that the architect is a one and only, is a person it's like working like an artist. And this has to do a lot with the special role of the architecture department in MoMA. But at the same time, when I started and I was asked, so what is your first exhibition? What would you like to do as the first exhibition? I was very hesitant, and I was thinking about what can I do? And I put some experiences, like my idea from the Biennale and by Fuchsas and others. I took these ideas together and I said, maybe I should bring up a show that presents the social relevance of architecture in the contemporary times. So this is what I did with the show, Small Scale, Big Change, New Architectures of Social Engagement. And this is just an overview on the 11 projects. And I selected these projects due to along some criteria, and I will explain that at the end of the lecture, what the criteria were. And I wanted to present architecture that had a strong impact into a underdeveloped, in a poor neighborhood, or into a neighborhood that was in danger. And I wanted to show that it was not only about a building, but it was about the process, it was about participation, it was about engagement, it was about local culture, respecting the local values, and all these things. And it was in the beginning, it was not easy to find really good examples, but getting in touch with some architects, I found more and more interesting projects, and then I could select from it and make it a show. So this is how it looked like in the entrance, and what I will do now in the next part, in the third part of the lecture, I will show you some projects that came out of this, they were represented in that show, but also that I followed later, because my idea is that these projects should, I should keep an eye on many of these projects and should follow if their impact is real and if it's measurable, what the architects say. Because normally, you can only see architects showing their projects in magazines when they're just opened, but you don't hear about the success or the failure of architecture later, because architects won't talk about it in public. So first of all, I want to show you now four or five projects from Africa, because I traveled there a lot in the last years, and I'm preparing another show in 2 years from now. So this is kind of a midterm review on some of the projects that I will bring up again in another show. And the first one is in Burkina Faso. Anybody been in Burkina Faso? Hands up. No? Why not? I think it's the third poorest country in the world. The average income is $1 per day. So you can imagine what that means. It's an average income. So you include the rich people. And the rate of illiteracy is 70%. So 30% of the population can only read and write. So you know what this means. And is a long story, which I try to make short, and if I'm talking too much, then just limit me. There is a story of an architect called Francis Kéré. He was born in a small village in Burkina Faso, and so this is where, just to give you a little bit geographical background, I didn't know about Burkina Faso when I came to MoMA in 2007, I confess. But I traveled there because I wanted to find out what is it really to be an architect there and what is it really to build there. And this is how the little village of Francis looks like. It's a typical village in the savannah, people living from the agriculture, like 80% of the income that's generated is from agriculture in Burkina Faso, and it's highly dependent on the water and the drought and the winds. So if the water season, the rain season is short, then a family of maybe 15 children, there might be only left 5 after the next winter because they don't have enough food. That's the real story. So this is how the people live there, and this is where I took the pictures myself, just to make sure that this is the reality. And Francis Kéré was born there as the eldest son of a tribe, so of a group of people, of a community of about 700 people, and his father was kind of the captain, the chief of this tribe, and he was the eldest son. And the father was getting tired or sad of getting letters from the community, like from the next city hall. Sometimes he got letters, and no one in the family could read these letters. So what would you do if you get a letter and you can't read it? I went there. I saw it. You go to the market, and there's people who can read, and they have a little typewriter, and they answer the letter for you if you get it. So his father was getting a little bit sad about this situation, so he sent his son as the first of his tribe to school, to an elementary school. And to make the long story very short, Francis Carré made his way to Germany. He got a fellowship after a while. He made from elementary school to a craftsman school, got a fellowship to Germany, stayed in Germany, because at that time there was no rule about asylum from Burkina Faso, because nobody believed in Germany that anybody could come from Burkina Faso to Germany. So he could just stay there. And he took evening classes. He made his high school degree. He started architecture at the Technical University in Berlin. And at a certain time, he was always sending money back to his hometown. At a certain time, one of his co-students said, "You shouldn't send back money. You should do something. You should build a school." And then Francis Carré was saying, "You're right." So he started to collect money, and this was the first crisis with his family because he stopped sending money. And he said, "I will collect the money to build a school." So the family said, "What? I mean, we need the money." He didn't send the money. He collected the money. He put even on the cafeteria in the Technical University, and I know students who saw that. He put a little model of the school that he wanted to build, where you could put in your spare money in the Mensa, and it was called Schulbausteine für Gando, so school bricks for Gando, for the school. What he did is, this is the school. He built the school in 2001, I think it was finished, and it's a very simple construction. It's compressed earth bricks, which created the second crisis with his family, because he came from Berlin, and he said, "I'm going to build a school," and he said, "I'm going to build it with clay, with the raw material that we have here." And they were like, "Are you mad? You studied architecture in Germany, and now you come here to tell us we should build with mud?" And he said, "Yes, you should, because it's the material that you can maintain, it's the cheapest, it's the best that you can get, and it's the one that you can afford also to keep up in the future." So it was a real big crisis, and this is how they made the bricks. With these machines, you see, it's very easy. I saw that, there's the pictures I took here, because they were building another building, and it's compressed, they dry it, and then they build it out. So very simple. And to make the story like the sound, that you get the success story, he won the Aga Khan Award for the school, and with the award, which is an undisclosed sum for money, so 5 architects get 1 million euros. It's but they don't say how much money each architect gets, and it's the first prize from 1980, started by the Aga Khan. The last ceremony was here in Lisbon. I was here when the prize was given, and this got an award. So the community now said, "Wow, we have an architect who's world famous now," and we built. Because the community was totally engaged in that, we built that school ourselves. So this gave pride and ownership to the community. And with the money that Francis got, he had to build an extension for the school, because when the school was opened, they had 3 times more applications for the school than they could take children. And it's not easy for a family in Burkina Faso to send children to school, because normally the children have to work in agriculture. If you have 10 children, you need them to keep an eye on the goats and whatever, and to work in agriculture. If you send them to school, they won't work for the food. So it's a kind of a really existential decision to send your children to school. But many of the communities did so, and this is what happened. So they had to build the extension, and this is what you see here. And the story is very, very long, but to come to, and with this example to an end, Francis built a library, because what can children do with reading and writing if they don't have books to read? This is the library shortly before it opened. And then in this year he built a women's center. So a women's center, we will talk about another women's center soon. And this is where they built like these big bowls that are for the grains, where they keep the grains. And this is kind of, the women's center is becoming an education center for women who take most of the responsibility for education, for health and everything, but still, as they are women in a higher age, they cannot read and write anyway, either, and they don't go to the elementary school, so they get their own education center. And this is how they use elements like from agriculture, build it into their center. So these projects, you see them on the right side. There's the school. There's this is the first school, the elementary school. This is the addition. This is the library. This is the teachers' housing, and this is now the women's center. And it goes on. And now the government in Burkina Faso, so the education ministry, came to ask Francis to come and said to him, "You must build a high school now for the children there." And he said, like, who's financing it? And they said, "You're going to finance it. You found always the resources. We paid for the teachers, and you built it." And this is the story, and it's going to happen. Francis is very successful now, and he's traveling back and forth, but it's also causing him a lot of stress. And he might get other projects very soon that you will hear from. But one is like, what I want to show you here at the end of this story is also that this is another school in Burkina Faso, in Koudougou, where a German couple, you see the white woman on the left, she's from Munich, and she had seen the exhibition that I had done in Munich, Arquitetura, and she had learned about Francis' work, and so she decided to hire him as an architect for a school project that she wanted to do in Africa. And this is a project that she financed now, and you see him in the middle here on the construction site, and this will open this September this year. So this is what I want to tell you, stories like this. Architecture can change a community, can change the life of children, can change a lot of perception of what an architect can do, and it's even beautiful, and it's sustainable, it's ecological, it doesn't need air condition, it doesn't need any electrical power, it is harvesting the rainwater, it's producing on so many levels with so low energy and so low effort, a high impact. And I think this is the lesson that I learned from Francis, and this is the lesson I want to tell you here, also with some other projects. So I might have to be a little bit faster maybe with the other projects. So another project in Rwanda which I visited is the Women's Opportunity Center by Sharon Davis. Sharon Davis is an architect from the United States. So just to change a little bit, like from an architect who came from Africa, was trained in Europe and went back, to someone who is trained in America but is now working quite often in Africa as well. And the project was financed by an organization called Women for Women. And it was started after the war in Yugoslavia, because everybody saw that after the war there were a lot of women left over without their husbands, without an income, and this organization tried to bring up economical training to, professional training to women after their husbands had died, so that they could get their own income. And this organization is very engaged also in Africa, and this is what they built. It's a community center for women in Rwanda, and everybody might remember the genocide, this incredible story of 1994, when 1 million people were slaughtered on the streets in Rwanda, and the United Nations didn't even stop it, because although they had the means to do so. And in this case, there were also many, many women left over without income, and because they were illiterate, couldn't read and write, they were like just working on a very low income level in agriculture. And Women for Women created this kind of center for women where they would learn themselves how to do agriculture better, to make a better income, to produce better and more, harvesting more fruits and food and things like that. And where they would also get what you see here, these circular rooms. These are kind of the training rooms where they could also learn how to read and write, how to calculate, how to do other things. And this is here the fabric, where they made the bricks themselves. So Sharon Davis, when she came to Rwanda, she said, first thing is that the women have to learn to build their center themselves, because only then they will later understand how to repair it, and also take ownership for the building. If it's just brought in from like industry from America, from somewhere else, they will just see it as a foreign object. But if they design with us, if they build with us, they will take over later and take the full responsibility. And this is how they make the bricks. This is the brick fabric. They showed me the bricks, and this is how they burn the bricks, and the skill center is just up the hill. So this is how they make it. And this was a picture I took myself. It was 2 weeks before the opening, and it's like 80% of the workers were women, which is unusual in Rwanda that women work on the construction site. And you see, they were really happy to give interviews, and they were saying, we are looking forward to open our center. And this was pictures I got later from the opening ceremonies, and it's a great success. And they opened also a market to the street, so where in the center they're like among themselves, so they're like a little bit in security, and outwards there is this market stand where people can from the street come and buy things. And I think that's another great example how an architect, in this case Sharon Davis, can make a change. Third project, let's stay a little bit in Africa. Now we go to Kibera, Nairobi. Kibera is one of the largest slums in Nairobi, and it's about, you don't know exactly because nobody does a head count in a slum. It's 2.1 square kilometers, and it's a little bit a hilly situation, so there's two little rivers running down, and I will talk about this soon. And the two little rivers come together here, right in this project, KPS, that you will see. This area is about 2.1 square kilometers, and it's estimated about 650,000 people living there. So triple Porto inhabitants. And now imagine the city of Porto without running water, without sewage, and without electrical power. And then imagine what happens tomorrow or in the next couple of days. And this is what it is. It's 650,000 people living without running water and without sewage. So they have a very, very dense structure there, and there's streets, again a picture I took there, streets that are like where you can sell and buy. It's kind of the market stands where you can buy also furniture. It's kind of a normal life. It's like living in a normal city. It's just, it has very special and extreme conditions. And the most extreme condition is, if you look back on the houses, it's these little rivers are used as like for the garbage and for, sorry to say that, for all the shit that you don't want. So, and now imagine the rain season's coming, so what's happening? All the shit is running into the houses. So at least there where the garbage can't flow off. And the architects in this case were a group of students from the Graduate School of Design in Harvard. They had a trip to Nairobi and they saw it, and they said, we cannot just go out here without any design. We cannot. And they started a process. They started to talk to community leaders in the slum. There's a lot of group organizations in the slum, so it's a normal life. It's a normal city, just under extreme conditions. So they talked to some of them, and they said, we would like to be, as designers, we would like to do something. So they pointed out the area where the two rivers come together, and the community leaders, they said, this is the most crucial problem that we have, that we get the floodings and the water is flowing back into the houses, so we have to somehow to solve that problem. And this is what the architecture students did. They didn't have an office yet at that time. They were really students before graduation. They started the design process and they said, together with the community, we can clean up the rivers and in the lower part, get all the garbage to a regular waste garbage away from that area, make the water flow again, and then take possession of that area and create a community center there. And this is what they created. This is the area, the same area after the Concrete Design Initiative project number 1. They didn't know it was their project number 1. They didn't name it number 1 because they didn't know that there would other projects follow. So this is where the community meets. They harvest the rainwater on the roofs, and then they have the water tank, and they sell the water, because there's one of the most expensive things in the slum is clear water. And if you live next door in an apartment house, you can just open the tap and you get the water for free. But in the slum, if you want to have a bottle of water, you pay maybe $2 for the water. And that's why you can sell the water there and make a profit. They made a little garden there, they sell the products. They made a basket weaving workshop, they sell the products, and so on and so on. So this became, from the beginning, it became a great success. And it created second and third projects. So the students were asked to come back. In the meantime, they graduated, they became real architects, and last year, they were sending me some questions about where they should go in the future, because they cannot be architects in America and at the same time full architects in Nairobi, because this is not paid, what they're doing here. And the question is, how can they continue? This is the third project. This is a kind of a public toilet that they created. And so this was on our group tour. And when they find an open space, they create something also for the children. Children never had seen before in the slum a playground. So this is what the students did with very simple means. And you can imagine, in the moment when it was open, the children were around. And this is kind of the little story. And they created, in the backside of the toilets, they created also a stand where the women who keep control on the toilets, get some money from the toilets, can also sell things, so a double income from both sides. So what are children doing now when they in the slum? Sometimes they get to school, they get a basic education, but then they have no idea where to go. There's a third project I want to show you in Kenya that's outside of Nairobi. That's a project that was developed together with a colleague of mine of the Technical University in Munich. It's a skills center. It's a center where children from the slums go for 6 months, get education as an electrician or as a craftsman for woodworking, like a carpenter. Like, there's 6 professions that they can learn in 6 months. Then they are sent to a firm that works in that field for another 6 months, and then they come back and get a testing, a degree, and then they can work as a graduated carpenter from that skills center, which worked very well. And this is the German students from Technical University working together with the African, the Kenyan carpenters, and they're building together with the local population. They're building this center, and this all was started, the skills center, by this guy Jimmy Kilonzi. He's a sociologist from the University of Nairobi, who at a certain moment said, we cannot change the world by publishing intelligent books. We have to do real things. And this is how he started the Skills Center. He contacted a German politician. The German politician contacted the architect in Munich. And this is how the ball was getting rolling. And this is, again, just pictures from the construction side, is such a success that now, because the Jimmy Kalonzi, the sociologist, went to Germany, brought in new technology from Germany, that the students who were trained there have an advanced knowledge of things that they would not get training in their neighborhoods, or if they would go to local businesses. And this is why they are now searched for and why they make money. And this is the Carpenter's Workshop, how they now have a better chance in life and how they can make their income. So this is just a few images, and this is the group of the students posing for when I was there. They were very proud to show me around, and they're extremely engaged, and I think it's a case where architecture has changed a lot. So now let's leave Africa for the next 3 projects, just to show you that my interest is not only in Africa or in third world countries, as we said 10 years ago. Now we call it like emerging, or I don't know, it's a difficult topic. So let's talk a little bit about Chile. Also in Chile we have a big problem with favelas, with informal housing, and the architect Alejandro Aravena tried to develop a project as a model project in a small town, Iquique, to produce housing that was very, very low cost, and it was also designed to be incremental. The task that was given to him was in a favela to build a housing project for 100 families for a price, each house for a price of $5,000. So the idea was the city of Iquique would give the people who were illegally settling in that neighborhood, would give a credit of $5,000 if they would agree to move out of their shacks for half a year and then move into these houses, which was a very, very complicated situation. And this is just one image of the endless meetings that the architect and the community leaders had to convince the people that this would be a real project and they would not be evicted later and removed to another part of the city, that they would really move into these houses. And what you see here is the architect solved the problem of the $5,000. For $5,000, you basically cannot build a house in building a half of a house, a 50% house, a structure that would be basically resistant to earthquakes and at the same time open, 50% space would be open, that the people who take the apartment could build out the houses themselves. So this is how they explain to the population how the project is going. And this is the day, let's say a couple of days before the opening. You would think now, oh, this is a construction site, it's not yet ready. But this is the concept that in a favela, in an informal settlement, people have a great network of knowing how to do things. So they can't do the structurally sound structure of a building, but they can do all the rest. They can do the facades, and they can arrange how to do a bathroom and all these things. So this is how it looked like, and this is 3 or 6 months later. So people started building out, and there's only one rule: you're not allowed to build on top of the roofs, because this would not be resist to the earthquakes. And this is how it looks like. So some people started building out immediately just one room. Some built like here with a little window, and then they started out to rent out these apartments that they built in their houses and pay off the credit to the bank. After 5 years, every one of these 100 families had paid off the $5,000 credit, and now was the owner of the house, and now could go to the bank and take a loan on the house. And this means that it has a great impact also in creating local businesses, because now they could open shops or other things in the future. So Alejandro Aravena with this Elemental group, they are extremely successful. They have built more than 1,000 houses like this in the meantime, and I don't know, I think numbers are still counting. And this is just to show you that this idea of incremental housing, as I showed of the 1930s, has come back in a way and has a very strong impact in this area. So now I want to turn for a moment, for the end, to also towards Europe, because I think it's very important also with the exhibitions that I'm doing, not to show only like remote areas in Latin America and Africa or India and like always looking at the poverty of the others, but to look on the social problems that are happening here in Europe, and there's a lot of them. And there's a lot of them that architects can also take care for and have create design ideas. So what is the project that has been finished already a couple of years ago, but had also now a lot of impact into the general thinking in France? There's this tower, Tour Bois-le-Prêtre in Paris. It's directly next to the highway circle around the city, and when you come from the airport you can see it, and it's directly next. And it was a social housing project of the 1960s, later was renovated in the 1970s, but not very poorly, and then in the 1990s, early 2000s, it was the city had decided to tear the house down, remove all the people who would be living there and bring them to other housing facilities. But the architects, Lacaton-Vassal, long story, they convinced the city to make this house a kind of a model case, a case study in how to save these structures, because they made the account, and they said, if we keep the house, renovate it while people are still living in it, and make the house better, it will increase the value of the house, it will keep the people inside, and then at the end everybody will be satisfied because the rent will not go up, the city will pay less, and the people can stay where they are. And this is what happened. They created a second surface around the building with prefabricated elements, tore down the inner facade, so everybody gets like 15 to 20% more living space with a balcony or depending on the structure of the building, and or a winter garden. So it has less energy for heating, it has more space, more light, more quality, and at the same time the house renovation cost less than tearing it down and removing the people. And this is how it looks like now. Everybody stayed inside, some people changed the apartments, and now they have, I don't have the image, but some have really from the balcony up there, they have a view towards the Tour Eiffel, and I think that's a kind of change, a social change, and they pay not more rent than before. I think that's where architects have a great role. So last project is, I guess this is very hard to spell in Portuguese, Vinci-Rast. It's in Vienna. This is a building you see here that's of the late 18th century. It's landmarked. It's a protected house, but it has a problem. And the problem is that it's landmarked, and at the same time, the ceiling height here is only 2.20 meters, and this is only 1.80 meters. So you hardly can, and it's all protected. So the developers were totally uninterested in the building. It's landmarked. It was coming really down, and an architect, Alexander Hagner, who is an Austrian, saw that building. And he saw another thing. He saw that students had in Vienna a great shortage of housing, and he saw that a lot of homeless people didn't get any place to sleep in the city. And he thought about, why don't we bring two problems together and solve a third, the problem of this house. So he said, we create living together, we create a space where homeless and students would live together and work together in the house to create income for both. And this is what happened. He talked to a developer who had always given money to social endowments, social organizations, and he said to this developer, like a big investor in Vienna, he said, like, don't give the money to social groups. Give the money and give the money to us, and we will build a house for a social purpose. And this is how it looks like now. And you see it has some shops, and in the front a restaurant now, which is called Vinci Rast. And Vinci Rast is the organization that keeps, that tries to bring homeless from the street and give them places where they not only sleep, but they stay. And what was created is now, I think it's 20 or 30 apartments with kind of living together, students and homeless. And they had interviews with the students and asking them, would you be willing to live with the homeless? And most of the students said yes, some weren't sure. And so after 2 years, it's a full success. It's fully booked. And the students pay the same rent as the homeless. So to create a social equality. So the homeless cannot be looked down, like you're homeless, you're paying less than us, the students. You can clean up the dishes because you're the homeless. No, they pay the same rent and they have to pay the same things. But they have free internet in the space. And this is for many homeless. It's the first time they have an address, where they, like a post address, and where they can use internet for free, and where they can also work. And they work here mostly in the restaurant, and they have also some other workshops in there, and create the income from which they pay the rent for their apartment, which is, I think, is a very, very smart. And you see also the restaurant. There was a big discussion about could they serve alcohol in the restaurant when the homeless are serving their alcohol, and so on and so on. But at the end, they decided, yes, we won't put any rules on the people who live here. We should create a social community that should work it out themselves. And as you see, this is just, I don't want to make propaganda for TripAdvisor, but you see it has like, this is like 3 weeks ago, it has like already a lot of reviews, and it's a lot of people going, and it has a community, and now it's bringing back to the city something in the neighborhood that hasn't been there before, because people now go there, eat there, and they have also on top of the, this is where, well, how it looks on the garden side, and this is on the top, they have a room that they rent out for special events, because from that room you can see the city, and they rent it out, and there's already like birthday parties and things like that, and that's another income that they create for this room. So this is, let's say, the final project that I wanted to show you. It's not in Munich, because Munich isn't there already. Recently, one architect asked me, he wanted to work in that field, and he said, like, who is the architect in Munich who works like this? And I said, I don't know anyone in Munich who works like Alexander Hagner or the other guys that I showed you. So let's come to the conclusion. This is the image of the Architecture Biennale 2012. It was when Toyo Ito was showing in the Japanese pavilion the space architecture possible here, question mark, home for all. And this was after the tsunami hit Japan, and you see it in the back. And Toyo Ito was questioning the role of the profession with this pavilion and saying what we need is not architecture, it's a home for all, it's a bringing back homes. And I think this is very important, sorry, too fast, that's very important to bring up the arguments, what am I looking for when I do the exhibitions, when I do the publications? I'm looking for architecture that creates social value. So it's not just responding to it, but it's also creating it. It's creating an additional layer into the design process. I want to propose and to publish and to show architecture that presents engagement, which is not just designing something and talking to the client or talking to the clients. It's just showing up that there is really something that is more than just working off the duties. It's an architecture that has responsiveness. Responsiveness means, in this case, is responding to the local conditions, to the traditions, to the local values, to the local population, to the maybe other values that you find, and you need to go, you need to do the research, you need to talk to the people and to find out. It's not that you can do it with, like, on your green table in the architecture office. And it has to have a strategic value, so it cannot only answer the question that is on a certain place, but it has to take in consideration also the other questions that are around it. So, and maybe become a model for other architects, for students, for other people to solve problems or to go in a direction. And the last and most important, it has to have a design value. It has to show that social design can be innovative, can be beautiful, can use simple materials in a very aesthetic way. It can engage people to follow it, because even in the poorest neighborhoods, and I have seen that in the slums of Kibera and other slums I've seen, people have a very, very a great eye on beauty, on good design. They can see it and they feel honored if an architect comes and does not only clean up, but gives them a object, a project that has a beauty. And this is, I think, are the main criteria that I wanted to put here at the end, and kind of as a coda, as the end of the end. The books that I have been publishing since the Small Scale Big Change were the Moderators of Change, other 25 projects. I started with 11. Moderators of Change had 25, only 2 of them were also in the previous exhibition. And then I continued with an exhibition that was traveling from Frankfurt to Vienna, Think Global, Build Social. And in this case, we didn't publish a catalog, but a magazine, Arch Plus, which is, I guess, the most socially engaged magazine since the 1960s, and it was coming out of that era when the social engagement was very, very en vogue in architecture. And they published a magazine which was very helpful. So it's in English and German, so in case you want to show. And this is the last exhibition I did in Munich. The first one I did in Munich, but the last on that topic was architecture, showing another 25 projects only in Africa. So I have now a big collection of data and projects, and it's counting. It's still more coming. And what I think is very important, that for the architecture show, we brought 14 architects from Sub-Sahara, from Angola, from Kenya, from many countries of Sub-Sahara to Munich to discuss this idea of how can architecture change communities. And it has been a great success, the conference, and it will be followed up. It was followed up by a second conference in Durban in South Africa, and next week I'm going to Johannesburg. We will have a third conference, and the goal is that we will create a second exhibition on contemporary practices in Africa, which will be presented in September, November 2016, next year in Munich again, and then travel as an exhibition to Africa. So this is what I've been doing, and just like some examples of the projects, and I could present you 25 more if you would have the time. And I want to end that lecture with my famous quote by Giancarlo de Carlo: "Architecture is too important to be left to architects." Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Andres, for this very interesting lecture. I will try to do some comments, and if you want, you can answer them. This last phrase is a murderous one for me, architect, but I really enjoyed your lecture and you're avoiding of, I think, some very cruel mistakes that usually when we talk about poverty in Africa are done. That is the aestheticization of poverty. I didn't saw a little bit of aestheticization of poverty. For that, I thank you, because I think it's very important to not play with this kind of things. Of course, I will do the devil's advocate twice, or 2 or 3 times, yes. For me, it's not really manageable or understandable to pass from Africa via Chile to Paris and Vienna. For me, there is a different paradigm and different values and different things at stake. So I will be a little bit critical of your, even though it's intelligent, because you're not doing this aestheticization of poverty, you're not dwelling just in poverty in Africa, but also in Latin America and also in Europe. Nevertheless, I think you have to have a big stomach to pass from Africa to Chile and then to Paris or Austria or Vienna. The thing is, of course, when you show us the images of Africa with no aestheticization of poverty, one has to be speechless. One has to be very admiring of your work, of the work that is done there. And when you really talk about genocide or human rights or these kind of things, one has to bow down and to be admiring of this kind of examples. The thing is, playing the devil's advocate, the danger is that we are doing perhaps, that you are doing perhaps a little kind of architectural goodwill or architectural tourism, or really not dealing with the roots of the problem, but with some elements of the problem. And should we really, as an architect, perhaps give up being an architect and do this ONG or kind of a social working thing? If really the problem is doing schools in Africa or resolving the questions of water and things like that, perhaps doing the social working or the ONG working or the political work is more important than being an architect in last case. And going to Chile and then to Paris and Vienna, what I want to also to criticize or to comment is a little bit what I think is perhaps I'm being cynical, but the opportunism of architects that now see that marketplace is in the social things and the social values. And so they are making this U-turn, like we did this afternoon, to social things and to social programs. And really, I've yet to find an architect that has a genuine interest in building without images, in building without photographs, in building without the internet, in building without architecture. And perhaps it's impossible to be an architect and to refuse architecture. So I think we're dealing with some difficult issues. And nevertheless, I enjoyed very much your gestual, your body language after these very difficult issues.
So there's a lot of criticism, I see. But the good news is, like, I have most of these arguments in my mind when I'm working. So first of all, thank you for pointing on this kind of not exploiting the poverty in the images, and it's really difficult. And I think the only image I used were the children on the playground, and the rest I tried really not to make it that you collect the money already, like, and give it to me. So it's like it's really about architecture. And I'm a curator. I'm working in a museum, and I want to engage our museum audience into the question: what is architecture today? This is my goal. And I'm not an architect. I cannot even build a house for the children there. I can only say, I can make connections, like, between ideas and thoughts. And maybe it's a little bit extreme to go from Africa to Chile and from Chile to Paris to Vienna, I know. But at the same time, for me, it's important to show both sides. If I show only Africa, you will run out of this room and say, oh yeah, these poor people in Africa. It's nice that some European architects work there, and maybe I can give them €100 next week or so, and then they can do another school. It's fine. But if I show only projects in Europe, it would be also difficult, because then, I mean, I could do so. Maybe come back and show the European projects, or go back into history. I think there's a lot of things. I mean, we saw this afternoon the CISA project, which is, I think, is also, we could talk about participation from the 1960s to now, and I think it's the participation element has gone down and not up. And I think we should talk about the lessons that we have learned in Europe from the 1960s, and many of the architects went later to Chile or to other parts, or like Peru, to build the projects there, because in Europe nobody was interested any longer. I don't know.
No, just more and more comment. I enjoyed very much the beginning of your lecture when you said, like I think I wrote or I thought, the truth is more ethics, more aesthetics. That is the truth. And also at the end of your conference, you spoke about design values. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, very important. But just to go a little back to modernism, the truth is, if you take the example of Brazil, there is always a struggle between the formal roots and the formal presence of modernism, and this idea of participation in doing social housing. One has to say that at the end of the day, the balance goes to the formal aspects and the heroic kind of classicism, and not to the participation values. Mm. So if you do the mathematics of the history of social programs in architecture, in modern architecture, I think that the plasticism and aerodynamism and the racism of the forms are much stronger than the social values. And that must be a problem.
No, sure. I mean, what I want to point out is there is, at the moment, as you say, there is a little, not a full U-turn, but there is a lot of architects now finding out that their image is sort of in question, that like it cannot go on with building high-rises and museums and things like that, only that there's something more that is, now when we go shopping, we ask, where is this food that we order in a restaurant? Is this local? Where does it come from? Is it was the cow raised in a good neighborhood or whatever? Was it raised ethically and so on? And this question, like also when we go shopping, can we really buy a shirt for $2.99 at H&M and then find out it was in Bangladesh the people were not paid enough, and they were later with the next fire were burnt down, and all these questions of where do our products come from? And I think this ethical dimension is more and more is brought to architecture, and I think architects feel now that they cannot just go on, and like Zaha Hadid saying, I don't care what happens on the construction site in the football stadium in Qatar, it's not my business, she said, when there was like a lot of people dying there, and now everybody is saying, sorry, there's something going wrong. If the architect doesn't take responsibility for the conditions of the workers in Qatar, there's something wrong. And for me, Ramkola is saying, I'm building the biggest propaganda building in the world, the CCTV building, and I don't care about the political situation in China. This is a building, and its architecture has sort of is unpolitical. I think this is not. We cannot accept this any longer. There is an ethical and a political dimension, and I feel there are many architects now standing up and saying, okay, we take this position, we try to answer to this, and maybe not always in full successfully, but at least it's an added value now that's coming.
Well, I think Remkels did a kind of a mea culpa in Harvard's speech and then in Venice, but he always goes to the opposite part of what's going on. So, any questions from the audience? We have half an hour. Liliana, 15 minutes. So it's a very, sorry, I'm looking to this direction. I'm being not very polite with this side of the room. But of course, this side of the room can also make questions. Come on. Joaquin?
Hi. It's really interesting that you finished your conference with exactly this sentence from Giancarlo de Carlo. I think there's something wrong with the mic. The thing about architecture, and I think that Georges' reaction saying that this is kind of a buzzkill sentence for architects to hear something like this, is that architecture has this problem with autonomy. Like, it wants to make its autonomy affirmative and clear. And in making that exercise, I think that there is a confusion between what the autonomy of architecture is and what the interrelations of architecture with other areas of knowledge is. So what I read in this sentence really is not that architecture is too important to be left to architects in the demeaning way for architects, meaning it's so important that we can't leave it with those dumb, not caring about the world architects. I read this as architecture is a lot more holistic than just what architects probably sometimes think it is. And so in inserting other dimensions, social dimensions, philosophical dimensions, political dimensions into architecture, I think is incredibly enriching of architecture. So I think that probably the reason why these projects of participation were so tried up until the 60s, and then they sort of died out, it's because the participatory process wasn't probably the best one, because these are a lot more important and interesting when you actually engage the community into the building of the thing, and not just ask, like, like Abraham that used to ask, okay, so where do you want your living room, and how do we make the internal organization of the house? Oh, okay, then we'll build it, and then you move in. So this is a lot more interesting because it involves like social dimensions, also philosophical dimensions, probably religious dimensions for these tribes. And I'm thinking of the non-European examples, of course. But then the Vienna example is really interesting too, because again, it involves a lot more dimensions than just the regular architecture program. So in trying to get an idea of autonomy, architecture just made itself the 1% of the 1% product, as opposed to thinking about everything that is in the fringes of this autonomy, and that it is incredibly enriching, and in no circumstance puts the autonomy of architecture in danger. And I think that's what architecture has to realize, is that we won't lose the autonomy if we enter in dialogue with other areas of knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very, very thoughtful and very complex comment, and it was less a question, as I understand, but really additional thoughts on what I've said. And I guess this question of autonomy is really something that I try to figure out, where does it come from that architects conceive themselves like as more or less generalists, autonomous profession that is like taking the elements of others but then bringing everything into design and then presenting it at this is it. This is just like where you win the competition or not, but it's not something that you can change later, or it's like architects don't care so much about what is happening with the building, or if there's something happening, they try to avoid that changes are happening and things like that. And I feel this autonomy is maybe, for me, from my point of view, is a result of the last 15, 20 years since postmodernism, when like architecture more and more tried to become like an art as a profession, and not like as it was in the 60s. And still in modernism, there were a lot of examples where architecture tried to more, like many times, really to engage with other questions. And I think that's very important. And about participation, what you said, I can fully underline and fully agree. And it's like, Alejandro Aravena recently in a lecture, he said also that he showed a process of participation, and he said it makes the process much more difficult. It's much more longer. It's more expensive at the end to really go through that process. And I did with students in Munich, we did an analysis of a housing project in Munich that was not low cost but medium, where the future owners were able to design their apartment, shape of their apartments. And we made an analysis, and at the end it was like all looked almost the same. It was like, so that the architect could have designed it, but the people who in the apartments said, no, I've designed that the wall is standing here, but 80% of the neighbors decided the same thing, so the architect could have designed it as well. So participation is an instrument. It's not a value of its own. It's an instrument in the process, and I think that's. I hope this is clear, that you have to use the instrument in different projects in different ways to make it to give it sense to it.
No, you must know, Andres, that we Portuguese don't do questions. We do comments. Okay. It's also, we don't have this notion of questions. Yes. Yeah. I will pass to you. This architecture is too important to be left to architects. It's paraphrasing. Politics is too important to left to politics. Economy is too important to left to economists. It's a well-known quote that it goes all around all the professions. And Giancarlo de Carlo was, by the way, a very, very nice architect. So, you.
Hello, hi. So thank you for the presentation. Can you listen? Yes? I have to say I couldn't disagree more with George. I know he was playing the devil's advocate. What he just said. And I was wondering whether, going back to that Venice Biennale, I think it was, less aesthetics and more, less ethics and more, no, sorry, more ethics, less aesthetics, that was it. Whether that shouldn't still be the case, because in a way, I can see where you're coming from, but the scenario seems that architecture schools, notably, are largely to blame, I would say, for this kind of inversion of priorities, of losing touch what architects are meant to be doing to start with, which is solving problems, and problems that should address the average people's quality of life, rather than engaging with images and this obsession with end products, and also paying much more attention, and you raised the point of Zahadid, to the process of, whichever outcome you get, you should really be careful about how to achieve it and how to implement it. So I'm just wondering whether, don't you have to be a bit more radical if you want to play the ethics card, because many people don't seem to be listening, so that's, that was my point. I can see that they go together, but maybe you have to go through a stage where they will not. Yeah,
I mean, the ethical card is something little bit doubtful about how to play it. I think it's in this title where I started from. I'm not a philosopher. I don't know exactly how to define ethics. I think for me, it's a kind of a consciousness of this responsibility that you have, and this responsibility is not only for the client or for a certain design question that you want to address, but it's more to open it up to more dimensions. And I don't know yet how I'm far from writing a theoretical book about it, and as we experience with most of these architects, they have no theories. They're working really, reacting directly to the projects, and we brought them together like 2 years ago in Austria. We brought like 12 architects who are working in this area internationally together to write a manifesto, which was then the first attempt to really address all these questions. And I think that has to continue because there's no theoretical focus yet. Everyone is like working in different areas, and I'm trying to bring these things together, and ethics is one of the buzzwords that I try to always use as to make it understandable what is the common line between these projects.
As a moderator, I cannot say a word, I've already said, but of course, in my point of view, in architecture, the ethics are dissolved or are within the aesthetics, or they are not really important.
Hello, my name is Joanna. I'm a Portuguese architect. I'm going to make a question. And I found your presentation really interesting. I'm a young architect, really interested in the architecture of social engagement. And I'd like to know, what do you advise to young architecture students or young architects that would like to practice this kind of architecture? As you said, the students that made the Kibera project at some point asked you, what should I do or where should I go? Because we know that this is the architecture for the 99% of the population, but in fact, it's not paid at all, or mostly it's not paid. So how can we balance the practice for the 99% that is almost not paid with the 1% of architecture that in fact give us the money that we need at the end of the month? I know that you are not an architect, but you know this reality, and maybe you can give us to the ones that are here, and if we are here, it's because we are really interested in this kind of architecture. What is your advice to us? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, which is a very, very important question, and I have a very complex answer to this. There's architects like Alexander Hagner in Vienna, who is now in Austria and in Germany one of the, let's say, most published architects. And I think I don't reveal any secret when I tell you that he calls me every 3 weeks and says, what can I do to earn money? I get invited to lectures, I get invited to congresses, I get invited to this, but I need jobs. I need to keep up my office. And this is, for him, it's a big problem, and we're working on it at the moment to get him maybe a teaching position or things like that. This is not the final solution, of course. And the second part of my answer is, there's an architect I didn't show today. He's Michael Maltzahn in Los Angeles, and he's working like in his office. He's running like 2 offices in one office. One is he's building houses for the super rich in Hollywood, and on the same time he's building houses for the homeless. There's a famous NGO, Skidmore Housing Trust, and this is Skid Row Housing Trust. And Skid Row is the area in Los Angeles where they have the most homeless people on the streets. It's estimated about 3,000 to 4,000 people living close to downtown on the streets. And Skid Row housing trust is building houses for them, and they developed a system that they can get medical treatments, that they can have a communal laundry, they have a communal kitchen, so they bring them back to life in society step by step, and these are extremely successful. And Michael Maltzahn is like kind of co-financing the design process for Skid Row housing with the houses he built for like the super rich. And I think that's the second part of the answer, that is, it's maybe not really a good answer, but it's at least one. And the third one is that Francis Carré now, with all the work he's done, and done with NGO work and with winning a lot of architectural prizes that were always consumed, eaten up by the projects he was doing. So he was always short with his money, and now he's got a teaching position in Mendrisio, and now he's kind of co-balancing it's his office with the teaching position, but still it doesn't work well. But now he's getting the reputation that he can win, and he won 2 competitions in Germany now. And then I think after that moment he will get on the next level, that he can afford a bigger office, and then he can also do bigger jobs, and maybe start other model of his studio. So there is no final answer to that, and I think it's a crucial question. How can you finance that? And there is no clear answer to that. Sorry.
Any more questions? In the front.
No, so if there is no social construction of the way to pay for this architecture, why should we, architects, get the responsibility to do something that we can't do as a profession? You know, it's a kind of offloading. No? Architecture is too important to be left to architects. But we, as architects, should provide for what society is not on the mood to pay for. No? It's a strange...
It's a very, very strong argument that you bring up. Why should we be blamed for it? That's a good way to turn the whole argumentation around, and I love that. It's the first time I hear it. I mean, there's Médecins Sans Frontières, there's Architecture Without Borders, and things like people working in that. That's a kind of an extra work. But I think what we saw with the history, like with Gropius and other people, really trying to bring up models for a future that would also include the low level, the low income into the future cities, into the future architecture, they weren't asked for it from the politicians. They were coming up with these ideas, and they were saying, like, because they had in mind that a future society has to be designed by the architect in general, and they were looking also on the lower. So right now, I don't see this engagement. I think engagement is maybe the word that I've used. It's not that there's a market yet, but I think as soon as there are more propositions, if there are more models, I think also politics will react to it. No, I mean, just trying.
As you can imagine, it was a provocation, because in Portugal, we had, after the revolution, very good examples of trying to socialize, to reorganize the profession, the practice, construction, the rental market, to understand how we can make the city for everybody. In Vienna, it was Adolf Loos that was doing evolutive housing, one-wall housings in the Garten Siedlung when they needed to produce food, and raise the municipal forests. And the Red Vienna was also there. And Ernest May was building on examples of the socialization of the housing law in Holland. There is a long history of sharing these. Otherwise, we always end up in the same postmodern joke of, we demolished Pruitt-Igoe because architecture was bad. Because in Portugal, we have this kind of very formative history, which is a very dramatic one, that if you do bad architecture for rich people, they can get another one. Imagine if you do bad architecture for poor people, they kind of get stuck with it, no? It's an extraordinary, cynical form of violence, no? So,
please do a question.
Huh?
No, it's impossible for the king to do a question.
No, it's not. I was exactly putting the question how we share this, but how we socialize these, because we're talking about social change. Huh? No one believes here that architects can bring social change alone. No?
I mean, one big problem in Africa, for example, is that there aren't any really schools teaching these questions. They're not addressing them. There are still many of these schools, either they have no schools, like there's in Congo, I think there's not an architecture school that we would talk about, and there's countries that have no architecture schools, and the architecture schools that are existing in some of these countries, they have still a curriculum that's based on the kind of colonial system of architecture, and I think there has to be also a completely new system has to be developed, that architecture can change things, and that these examples that I showed, like Kilamba, that they could be avoided, because if politicians would have a knowledge about that, there's better examples, there's things happening not only in Frankfurt and Vienna, but also in Africa, that there is a change in politics coming. I mean, that's my hope.
Any more questions? Criticisms? Applications? So, it's all right? Thank you. Okay, thank you, Andres. It was great. Thank you all.